Learn provided me with a PowerPoint template, which also included this figure at the left. And I think it's quite useful for me to start my story. So if you have a look at this, this image, you see this white building. It's a bit of a boring building. It's white. It's simplistic. It has square windows, and that's about it. No colors. And from these square windows, you look at a very nice green meadow, which is quite the opposite, with complexly formed trees. We have people sitting there, they're walking around, they're talking. Some of them are fully interacting, others not. So this is the real world, you could say, and which is quite a big contrast with the white building, which in my story is a typical lab paradigm in neuroscience. So the quest we have as real-world educational neuroscience is to make this journey from the lab to the real world. And I think this figure nicely captures the challenge we have. So if we have a look at the left, this is a typical lab paradigm. It's highly simplistic, the stimuli used. It's artificial, it's isolated, it's not in interaction with any other human being. So that's the situation in many EEG and fMRI experiments. So if we have a look then at the right, the real world, that's a more typical, well, educational experience. It's with, it's not on your own, but it's in interaction with other students, with your teacher, and it's much more messy, as you can see, the real world. And this is the journey we have to make as educational neuroscience. So the problem we have is that many experiments have a low ecological validity, and they not easily generalize to the real world learning situations. And as we will discuss today, there are mobile techniques we can use in these real world environments, but still we also have to make the journey back to the lab experiments. So let's first start with a formal definition of educational neuroscience. These use cognitive neuroimaging studies into learning and development, bringing indirectly and directly useful insights to improve learning and teaching in the practice. And the workhorses of educational neuroscience are functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, and electroencephalography, EEG. And I think the lab paradigms as they are already proved useful for educational science because, for example, we learned that brains develop much more protracted than we previously thought. That's something we learned from MRI studies. We learned about memory processes that are relevant for education, or for example, the role of prior knowledge. Another use case is neuroprediction. So there are several studies showing that if you include a neural measure to your behavioral measures, your prediction of relevant educational outcomes improves. We have other examples more from neurodevelopmental disorders like dyslexia. The better understanding of what happens in the brain helps understanding the disorder and thinking of new interventions. And lastly, but also important is that there are many proliferating neuromyths in education, and educational neuroscience helps to debunk many of them. So these are just a few examples of how educational neuroscience is relevant, even though ecological validity is still low or a problem. So the limitations in ecological validity are not unique for EEG of fMRI studies. They're more general the case for any experimental cognitive research in which controlled stimuli are used with many repetitions. But you could say that for neuroscience experiments, these limitations are even more strong. So this is nicely discussed in a review paper by Van Attenveld and colleagues. So what then is the goal of real-world educational neuroscience? The goal is to increase the ecological validity of neuroscience investigations into learning and development. And there are actually quite a few ways to increase ecological validity of this research field, but I want to emphasize two of them. The first one is bring the real world to the lab by using representative design principles. The other option is to bring the lab to the real world using, for example, naturalistic design principles. And it is allowed recently by the mobile neuroimaging techniques we have. So I will focus on the second one today. But before I start, I want to contextualize where mobile neuroimaging plays a role. So the far left figure shows the typical lab experiment. And if you go to the right, you will have more and more realistic study designs, you could say. So what you could do is use more realistic stimuli. So that's part of the representative design. So an example is a study by Kamplon at Lee, where it's actually an fMRI experiment, but I use an EEG cap in this figure. And there they use a Sesame Street video about mathematics. And they relate this to the same brain area in the parietal lobe as a more systematic design lab study. But if you go more to the right, you could also study mathematics or numerical processing using online learning, for example. So it's a bit more less restricted, you could say. But still you have some room to control the situation. And then even more to the right, you have the classroom experience, which is as real world as it can be, and where you can use mobile EEG caps, for example. So these are from the left to the right, lab, semi-naturalistic and more fully naturalistic study options in real world neuroscience. So as you can see, these study designs vary on two dimensions, and these are experimental control and ecological validity. If you go from the left to the right, experimental control will drop, will become lower, while the ecological validity will become higher. So these are inversely related, these two dimensions, and therefore it is always a trade-off, you could say, for each research design. So the more lab-based studies are part of systematic design, as Brunswick would call it. Then using more naturalistic stimuli or situations, you would call these more representative designs. And if you go more and more to naturalistic environments, you need naturalistic designs. And then conventional technology is good enough or is usable for stationary lab-based experiments, but the technology has to become more mobile when you go to more fully naturalistic studies. And I want to emphasize that all these stages are needed in educational neuroscience. We need lab-based studies because they are really good at isolating specific cognitive functions under very controlled circumstances. And these kind of studies provide us with a good sort of grounding for the more naturalistic studies. And they can inform also more naturalistic studies. The semi-naturalistic studies are useful as a sort of a bridge to the fully naturalistic studies, but also as a test to see whether findings from the lab generalize to more naturalistic situations. And then we have the fully naturalistic studies. They are low in experimental control, high in ecological validity. It's not the best testing ground to test a theory, but it is a very nice way to get new hypotheses. And these, again, can be tested in more controlled lab experiments. So it's what we think a cycle, and we need all these kinds of studies to inform educational practices. All right, so we discussed a statement, problem statements. I gave you a definition of real-world neuroscience and why it is needed, and how it is, how it has a place in a cyclic research model. So we'll continue with mobile neuroimaging. I will give a current state of affairs, and then importantly, we also discuss a few ethical considerations of using mobile neuroimaging in educational neuroscience. And we end with a few ways forward. All right. So mobile neuroimaging systems are small. They have to be lightweight, battery powered, and they can be worn by participants without being fettered by wires to an amplifier or other recording devices. So they tend to be wireless, and they use, for example, Bluetooth connectivity to a smartphone or a computer. So we have two techniques that can be made mobile right now. And the first one, which is also used most often now in mobile neuroimaging research, is EEG. And the interesting thing is that I think around 10, 12 years ago, the first mobile systems that came to the market were commercial. They were not really for research purposes, but for example, neuro-enhancing applications like neurofeedback. So they were for the consumer markets, and they frequently used just one electrode on the forehead, for example. They used dry electrodes instead of wet electrodes. But then you see in the literature a sort of the first few studies showing up using these commercial technologies to study, neuroscience. So I think it was more like the reason they went for these commercial systems is because there was not much else on the market. And there were quite a few interesting studies the last 10 years. And now you see very recently there are also more research grade systems on the market with better signal quality, more electrodes, and so on. Then we have functional near-infrared spectroscopy, fNIRS, and that's comparable in a way with fMRI. It's a way to measure oxygenated versus deoxygenated hemoglobin in the blood, especially in the cortex, so around 4 centimeters deep. And these are but it's from a more recent, it's more recent fNIRS. So there's not that much research in real-world environments compared to EEG. So the current state of affairs. So we have these nice technological developments, and I think you will see many developments in the near future improving the technology. But I think the real challenge for the researchers is to come up with smart research paradigms that are used alongside mobile EEG and fNIRS. And at this point in time, they vary considerably in how naturalistic these research paradigms. So I will provide a few examples with increasingly naturalistic designs. So we'll start with how mobile neuroimaging is used to increase inclusion in science. Then we'll continue with lab paradigms in naturalistic settings, then applications in educational technology, and we end with well, sort of the holy grail, and that's the naturalistic paradigms in naturalistic settings. So the first example, inclusion in science, is interesting because if you think about it, most research happens in Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries or weird countries. And there's this nice research article title called "Most People Are Not Weird." And the whole point they make is that much of our understanding of human brain development is effectively based on non-representative samples in weird countries. And even in weird countries, much of the research is in higher functioning or higher SES socioeconomic status samples. So it's really a biased sample, you could say. So there, the use of mobile neuroimaging comes in as well. And it's interesting because I explained that mobile neuroimaging can be used to get better representative situations and research, but you can also use it to get better representative samples. So here, two examples. The first one is a study by Pietro and colleagues. And they used a cheap mobile EEG system to study the effects of cognitive training in schools in low socioeconomic status children. So that's an example of using this technology to reach participants that normally would not participate in such a study, because they have less opportunity to go to a university or a hospital or to a university lab. So this is a way to include these samples as well. Then the second study is a fNIRS study by Jasinska and colleagues, and they used fNIRS, or they made an fNIRS protocol to use in real settings. And in their example, they had their research done in Côte d'Ivoire. So this is an example of including non-weird countries. So this is an interesting paper because it provides tips and tricks how to set up such an experiment in these areas. All right, so the second use case of mobile neuroimaging. That's for validating lab paradigms in the real world and validating mobile technology in the real world with lab paradigms. And that's a very crucial step in the development of real world neuroscience, because we have to know, of course, that these systems measure EEG reliably. So they use lab paradigms in naturalistic settings. So the most often used paradigm is the Opal task. It's probably familiar for all of you, but to be sure, I'll explain it briefly. It's a sort of an attention task with many repeated tones, low tones, and sometimes there's an Opal tone, a high frequent tone, which is called the Opal. And then the participant has to press a button or has to count. So it sounds a bit like this, if you can hear this. So again, an example of how, no, you didn't hear it. It was, okay, but it's like beep, 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 beep. All right, so you realize again how artificial these paradigms are, right? Even though they are, as I will show, used in the real world. But the neurosignature of interest is P3, which is a positive deflection in the event-related potential between 300 and 600 milliseconds, and it's index of attention. So there are several reliability studies in which mobile EEG systems are used in conjunction with this Opal paradigm. And typically, participants cycle on the campus, or they walk on the campus, university campus, while they are doing this Opal task. And then they compare it to a sitting condition or a lab condition. And what they find is that the P3 amplitude is reduced in these more real-life conditions like walking, not because of more noise in the data, but more because of distraction or increased processing demands in real-life scenarios. So that's interesting finding. Also interesting is in more recent technology, which they call transparent EEG. It's not really transparent, but it sits behind the ears and it's nearly invisible because of that. And I think that has potential use cases in classrooms because it will help research to be more naturalistic, but also for children or participants to be less distracted by the technology, I would say. So that's an interesting use case. So a study this year came out where they used this transparent EEG in combination also with the op-ball task, but then with the stimuli being very sporadic. So each minute there was a stimulus, for example. And that made it possible that the participants could work a full working day while their attention level was measured as well with the sporadic op-ball task. The last example here is a study in the classroom. I think it's with the university. No, it's not the university students. This woman looks younger, but it's at least it's in sort of a lecture, and there they include some sporadic visual stimuli as well. And there they relate the reaction time to the stimuli with frequency band changes in the EEG. But one of the problems is with lab paradigms is they impose a real limit to how natural real-world neuroscience can be because they involve the same artificial stimuli as are used in the lab. So that's something to, I think, an important takeaway. And also, I want to emphasize, it is almost always sort of a dual task because you are doing your real-world thing, like cycling, walking, or listening to the lecture. But then at the same time, there is this lab task they have to do, even though it's sporadically. It's a sort of a dual task. So you have to attend to both the lecture and the lab paradigm. So I think that's problematic as well. Okay. So the third use case of mobile technology, it's a bit different than the others. It's for applications in educational technology. So if you think about, so most of those studies are focused on online learning environments. And if you think about it, that's quite useful because it's like the example I showed you before. It's an educational situation you have more control on compared to real classrooms. So it's a nice intermediary between the lab and the real world classroom. So a review by Xu and Zhang, they found quite a few studies where focusing on educational technology. And it's important to emphasize again, these are studies done by computer scientists, not really neuroscientists. So the focus is really on the technology and less on the neuroscience and the understanding behind it. Okay. So they discuss 4 examples of educational technology, attention monitoring and alarm mechanisms in schools, intelligent tutoring systems, instructional design and edutainment research. Edutainment stands for educational entertainment, and neurofeedback training. So for number 1 and number 4, I will give 2 examples. So the first one is a study by Chen and Wang. And there, a teacher provides online learning for several students. And while these students are reading and learning, they wear a mobile EEG system. And this mobile EEG system measures alpha frequency power, which is related to attention, And when this alpha power is too high compared to a baseline, then a signal sends out to a program which the teacher assistant looks at, and if there are too many attentional lapses, which will be counted, as you can see, then the teacher assistant delivers an alert to the student that they have a low attention level and that they have to, well, attempt again. So a few things. Well, it's interesting on itself, the technology, but there are a few drawbacks if you think about it. First one is it is really the question if you can measure attention reliably in an individual, not on a group level, especially because of the noise in mobile EEG systems. And the second problem is more from an ethical nature. Do we want this? Is this how is this with privacy issues, autonomy, and so on? So we will focus more on the ethical issues in the next slide and at the end of this talk. Okay, so the Wall Street Journal found out that this technology is not only studied but actually applied in Chinese classrooms. And I think the video will speak for itself. So I'll show you this.
红色是表示你的专注力显示得很高。
Teachers at this primary school in China
蓝色是走神了。
know exactly when someone isn't paying attention.
白色就是你可能跟网络还没有连接好。
These headbands measure each student's level of concentration. The information is then directly sent to the teacher's computer and to parents. China has big plans to become a global leader in artificial intelligence. It has enabled a cashless economy where people make purchases with their faces. A giant network of surveillance cameras with facial recognition helps police monitor citizens. Meanwhile, some schools offer glimpses of what the future of high-tech education in the country might look like.
做出选择吧 Good job!
Classrooms have robots that analyze students' health and engagement levels. Students wear uniforms with chips that track their locations. There are even surveillance cameras that monitor how often students check their phones or yawn during classes. These gadgets have alarmed Chinese netizens. But schools say it wasn't hard for them getting parental consent to enroll kids into what is one of the world's largest experiments in AI education. A program that's supposed to boost students' grades while also feeding powerful algorithms.
为了就是国家的这个研究呀、发展呀，我觉得是没有问题。
The government has poured billions of dollars into the project, bringing together tech giants, startups, and schools. We got exclusive access to a primary school a few hours outside of Shanghai.
同学们早上好。
To see firsthand how AI tech is being used in the classroom. For this 5th grade class, the day begins with putting on a brain wave sensing gadget. Students then practice meditating.
现在想象我们眉心有一点柔和的光芒绽放。
The device is made in China and has 3 electrodes, 2 behind the ears and 1 on the forehead. These sensors pick up electrical signals sent by neurons in the brain. The neural data is then sent in real time to the teacher's computer. So while students are solving math problems, a teacher can quickly find out who's paying attention and who's not.
说明这段时间他是有点在那走神的。
A report is then generated that shows how well the class was paying attention. It even details each student's concentration level at 10-minute intervals. It's then sent to a chat group for parents.
就是他可以看到每个人的评分。
The reports are detailed, but whether these devices really work and what they exactly measure isn't as clear. We were curious if the headbands could actually measure concentration, so one of our reporters tried on the device.
但我没有感觉自己特别集中。
This is a new technology with still fairly little research behind it.
Theodore Zanto is a neuroscientist at the University of California, San Francisco. He was surprised to learn that this tech, called electroencephalography, also known as EEG, is being used in the classroom on children. It's usually used by doctors in hospitals and labs.
EEG is very susceptible to artifacts. And so if you are itchy or just a little fidgety, or the EEG wasn't set up properly so that the electrodes didn't have a good contact, affects the signal.
Despite the chances for false readings, teachers told us the headbands have forced students to become more disciplined.
上课回答我的问题，就是他们的声音会比平常更响亮。
Teachers say the students now pay better attention during class, and that has made them study harder and achieve higher scores.
上课认真听讲，作业做的基本上是全对的。
But not all students are as enthusiastic.
就是自己感觉是脑筋，我感觉这里有个紧的。
This fifth grader, whom we caught dozing off in class, told us his parents punish him for low attention scores. And that kind of data adds a new kind of pressure for students.
你想啊，如果在一次考试全班人都考了95分以上，就你考了一个85，你会不会感觉你有一种
Companies we interviewed said the data can go to government-funded research projects. We spoke to parents who were unclear about where the data ended up, and they didn't seem to care too much. Zanto says there's likely no privacy protection at all.
In a classroom, if you're trying to make an assessment of an individual student, you really can't anonymize it.
Experts and citizens alike are sounding alarms about various aspects of the country's huge push into artificial intelligence. These classrooms are laboratories for future generations. And while these new tools may potentially help some 200 million students raise their grades, just how this all works out won't be apparent until they become adult citizens.
All right. I'm wondering what you think about these applications. So maybe we can discuss this further at the end of the talk. But imagine that I'm measuring your brain waves right now, and I get like a notification if you are sleepy, or what will that mean for the future? I don't know. All right, another example of the use of educational technology is neurofeedback training. And I want to stress this is an example of our own research group. And I hope we don't have the ethical issues we discussed before. And I don't think so, because I think the ethical problem is if you want to control students too much. I think that's a problem. But in this use case, we actually want the students to feel in control over their own learning process. So it's really a different goal. And also it's part of a research study, and of course not applied everywhere in classrooms without good reasons. So I'll show you a video again where we use cheap commercial EEG systems, also with one electrode, and it's part of a growth mindset intervention. So the whole growth mindset intervention consists of 4 one-hour classes, and there they learn about brain plasticity, about growth mindset, what it entails, what it means for themselves. And then the third lesson, they have this neurofeedback experience, a one-time experience, and the goal of this experience is for the students to feel in control over their own brains, and we think that helps bring in the message of the growth mindset. So you know the context in which we use this system. So just a few preliminary results of what we did. In this graph on the y-axis, you see the attention level as measured with the theta-beta ratio, which is based on frequency content in the EEG. So if it's higher, it's actually lower attention. When it's lower, it's higher attention. I know that's that's difficult, but if it's lower, it's better. So on the x-axis, the first few, can I use a pointer? Yes. So here, these are the baseline measures. So they were not doing anything, just resting. And then here they had the different neurofeedback applications. So the lie, the brain cells, and the reading. And as you can see, they were successful in lowering this ratio and increasing their attention doing these two exercises, but not the reading. And I know this is maybe not very scientific, but we asked them, like, are you more convinced now that you're in control of your own brain? And around 90% said yes, so we thought that's quite high. But we also asked them, can you explain it a bit more? And quite a few of those yes had some convincing, well, arguments, I could say. So this example, first, I thought I could not change anything about what my brain was doing, but now I'm sure I can influence my own brain. So that seems genuine. So we're very interested to see how this intervention affected the growth mindset and their motivation for learning and their learning outcomes in the years to come. All right, then the last use case of mobile neuroimaging is well, to use naturalistic paradigms in naturalistic settings. So the key challenge is in the coming years is to design these naturalistic paradigms that allow us to take full advantage of the technology. And why is this a challenge? Well, as I explained, the typical EEP paradigms like the OBOT task outside the lab are still very artificial and they interfere with the learning process or with what they are doing in the classroom. Real-world learning situations are relatively unstructured, so that's difficult, and therefore specific neurocognitive processes are difficult to isolate. So what you would typically do with the EEP paradigm is to have frequent stimuli and control conditions, and then you can have, with a millisecond resolution, have event-related potentials to study specific cognitive processes. But that's very difficult in unstructured real-world classroom environments. So the main challenge will be to balance the naturalism with experimental control in these situations. So what may work? You can still use personal or environmental events to segment your neuroscientific data with a lower temporal resolution, so within, well, seconds, minutes, or hours. But because of that, you are able to explore more general cognitive states like engagement or someone's attention level or arousal. But as I explained, it's more difficult to have a higher millisecond resolution of more specific states. And the nice thing is that classroom activities tend to be quite structured and sort of have a block design because there are different teaching activities throughout the day in the classroom. So you can use this structure as part of your naturalistic design. So something which seems very suitable for these naturalistic studies is hyperscanning. So I'll explain what that is. So hyperscanning describes situations in which brain activity is recorded from two or more people simultaneously. And it's also called second-person neuroscience because it allows to really study the interaction between brains and not only one brain in isolation. So what is it? If you have multiple students and you measure their EEG, when they attend to the same stimulus, in this case, the teacher voice here, because of entrainment, the EEG waves will synchronize with the structure of the stimulus, you could say. That's what we call entrainment. So if that happens for one person, it looks a bit like this. So if they don't attend to the stimulus, it's asynchronous, but here it becomes synchronized to the stimulus. But if a group of students similarly or jointly attend to the teacher or the teaching material, they will also have a similar entrainment to the stimulus. So indirectly, that leads to synchronized brain activity between students. And this synchronized brain activity is has been related to the shared attention, to engagement. So if a class or if a teaching activity is more engaging, it will increase the students' inter-brain synchronization. But it's also been related to social dynamics in classrooms. And I think the most exciting example is a well-known study by now by Dicker and colleagues, where they studied this hyperscanning in 12 students during a whole semester. So they actually had 11 days, recording days, and each day the students had 4 kinds of teaching activities. And they looked at mostly at student to group synchrony. So how one student's EEG synchronizes to the rest. So in this study, brain-to-brain synchrony was driven by stimulus properties. So in this case, the teaching styles. And they actually found that watching an educational video was most engaging for the students, and at the same time also had the highest brain-to-brain synchrony compared to the teacher lecturing. So that's interesting to realize, and probably not a something you could expect. But also individual differences were related to brain-to-brain synchrony, like student focus, the teaching style preference of the students, how much they like the teacher, and their personality traits like empathy were related to brain-to-brain synchrony. And they also found that face-to-face interaction prior to class served as an activator. So they had 3 resting state conditions before the teaching started. And that was looking at a wall and looking at each other. And the ones who faced each other before the class, they had higher brain-to-brain synchrony during the class. And they also reported, but only when they reported to be more close to each other via self-report. So it shows that it's related to, outcomes that are very relevant for education. But even though this is very exciting, it's also very pioneering, it's very new. It's really a work in progress. If you have a close look at these studies, then you have to accept that true realism still suffers because of some necessary experimental control, and I'll explain. In this example, in the Dicker study, the teaching was relatively short. So it was actually only 30 minutes of effective teaching, divided also over 4 activities. So it was like 3 minutes video, 2 minutes discussion, 4 minutes lecture. So these were really brief periods compared to real life education. Because of the structure, there was also limited room for spontaneity and variety in the teaching. Minimal to no conversational exchange occurred in a follow-up study. So that's quite unnatural because they wanted to prevent too much EEG noise and movement artifacts. Students were even instructed to reserve any questions or discussion for after the recording. The teaching itself was also reported by the researcher to be less naturalistic because the teacher had to remain seated and to minimize head movement. So that was quite like an unnaturalistic pose the teacher had to take. And still, even though all of these limitations, the rejection rates were quite high, between 40 and 60%. And the most interactive part of the lessons, the discussions, the group discussions, in one of the biggest study had the highest rejection rate. So it really shows that this is a problem. Okay, then I want to move to some ethical considerations. And one concern is like, okay, you can have concerns of some ethical issues for the research done in education neuroscience with mobile neuroimaging, but it's even more problematic when it's done by commercial parties and when they overpromise what you can do with these technologies. So the reasoning of these commercial parties is sort of a combination of these two things. They use a brain-computer interface for scraping brain data, so reading brain data. And then based on what they measure, what they got from the brain, they use neuro-enhancing techniques on that to sculpt the brain and to improve performance. So it's a sort of a reading-writing combination. And there are many, like plenty examples in the literature. So this is Focus Calm headset. It says train your brain to reduce stress. This is Impulse. And they have these well, nice looking, very scientific well, websites and videos. Human-friendly neural interfaces start here. We create the world's first neural interface for day-to-day business talks, medical therapy, training, and entertainment. Neurotech for the global community, and so on. So, ethical researchers like Williamson, they warn for neurogovernance. And they say neurogovernance is they scan the brain, it's scraped for data, and then the brain is sculpted towards particular capacities. And these are some concerns we have. The first one, children are likely to be a key target group for cognitive enhancement for educational purposes. That's something to be aware of. The coercive use of neurostimulation and neurofeedback should be something in the back of our minds. Privacy risks related to brain signal recordings, new forms of discrimination that may arise from these neuro augmentations, and the potential to be used to exercise neuropower over individuals. So just an example of the Chance study in which EEG was used as a sort of attention monitoring system. It can be used, of course, for good things. So if you want to improve your own teaching and you have this feedback, you can improve your teaching. That would be something nice. But at the same time, you can have like so much control over your students and what they are doing. That's probably quite unhealthy. So Nienke, she's here as well, Professor Nienke Atteveld and colleagues, including myself. We are therefore very interested in responsible research and innovation approach, EARLI. And there we ask the question, what is the right impact of portable EEG on social classroom dynamics according to different stakeholders or these kind of applications? And I think the important thing is to really think of well, both positive and negative consequences before and during the research, and not only afterwards. And therefore, it's really important to include all stakeholders in the process and before and including them as well in the design of your study. that's something we are really interested in to use. And then, of course, sharing is important in this new pioneering field. So Nick and I started the emerging field group on portable brain technology in educational neuroscience research. And that's a collaboration with a group of international researchers that do this kind of research using mobile technologies. And we not only want to share the knowledge within our group, but more importantly, we want to share it with others in the field and start a research community in this area. So next year we have a few things going on. First, we hope to get a review article on mobile neuroimaging and education neuroscience published, which follows the same structure as this talk. We want, if COVID allows, we would like to have a mobile neuroimaging workshop, and of course, Learn members are invited as well, and we keep you posted. We received the EARLI research support fund to buy 2 research-grade mobile EEG systems, which is very nice because I think they will arrive this year, any moment. But it's also a nice way, at least in the IBA research community, to start collaborating and learning together how to use these systems. With a Sensa research group, we are hiring a new PhD student for a hyperscanning study in schools that we plan to do to study collaboration and social mindfulness. And of course, we like to involve the Learn community, and I'm very open to your suggestions, and I hope that maybe this talk will make you enthusiastic about this field and maybe interested to, well, to collaborate or to work together. And then lastly, I want to thank first of all Niek van Attenveld, then the Lab of Learning, Sensa, and the EARLI and the IBA and Learn communities, and Waag Society. So I would like to answer your questions and maybe have a brief discussion about this topic. Thank you.